Last week, I took you through the second chapter of Genesis and indicated in my coverage of it that, structurally speaking, that chapter constitutes an exposition which is going to be worked out during the chapter we're considering today. I'm sure it goes without saying that I think the doctrinal system that Christians hew to has misconstrued this whole story, and I'm going to offer an alternative reading which I believe makes a lot more sense. I will grant them this, however. Life is hard, for many utterly intolerable, and no one is exempt from its vicissitudes. Those many trials and sorrows are indeed the result of who we are and the nature of the world we live in. It's just that Christians are wrong about how things got that way. Things were always that way. It's been that way long before the advent of anything we would consider conscious awareness. It's the nature of this planet, which has been a killing field since the dawn of the Cambrian at least. That said, I also believe this story to be one of the richest in the Bible on account of the numerous insights that lie just beneath its metaphorical surface. I'll devote a couple of Sunday school lessons to this story. Here's the story as presented in the New Revised Standard Version. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?' He said, 'I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself.' He said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?' The man said, 'The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate.' Then the Lord God said to the woman, 'What is this that you have done?' The woman said, 'The serpent tricked me, and I ate.' The Lord God said to the serpent, 'Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel.' To the woman he said, 'I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.' And to the man he said, 'Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return.' The man named his wife Eve, because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and for his wife, and clothed them. Then the Lord God said, 'See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever.' Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life." The story found in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis is a myth, and since it's essential to understand what a myth is, I'll give you some definitions. Here are two that I find in my Webster's. A traditional story originating in a pre-literate society dealing with supernatural beings, ancestors, or heroes that serve as primordial types in a primitive view of the world. Also, a real or fictional story, recurring theme, or character type that appeals to the consciousness of a people by embodying its cultural ideals or by giving expression to deep, commonly felt emotions. The same dictionary also offers a colloquial definition, the one you're apt to hear in everyday speech, namely, a fiction or half-truth. But I don't have that usage in mind when I talk about myth in this context, any more than I have the colloquial usage of theory in mind when I talk about the theory of evolution or music theory. I've used the term etiological quite a few times in these lessons so far and understand myth in this context to be a close synonym of etiology. The myth of the fall, recorded in Genesis 3, is a particularly rich etiology, setting forth a broad range of insights couched in the words of a fable. To list a few, it explains the second-class status of women in the ancient culture that wrote the myth, a toxic idea that had infected humankind long before it was captured in this myth and which sadly persists in our time, especially among religious fundamentalists of all stripes. I'm sure many manifestations come immediately to your mind. Christianity has certainly been infected with it, and while I applaud the courageous efforts of more liberal-minded Christian denominations to exorcise that toxic idea from their churches, there are plenty of Christians who simply see it as the divine order, never to be questioned. I'd offer such hate preachers as Stephen Anderson, along with his odious leporello Matt Powell, as a case in point. If you're not familiar with that particular boil on the ass of Christianity, I'd encourage you to have a look. His hateful rants are all over YouTube, and he has a sizable following who will never question any of it and despise those who do. It also explains why so many women die in childbirth, or did before advances in, medical science, which has nothing to do with those cures in Leviticus. It explains why farming the soil is such onerous, exhausting work and why the crops so often fail despite all the toil and care we lavish on them. It even offers an explanation for why snakes slither instead of walking and why so many humans have a seemingly innate fear of them. Above all, this story speaks to the human condition as a whole. It's a fanciful account meant to explain why things suck as badly as they do. Of course, this explanation is precisely as off the mark as the Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga. What the story gets wrong, of course, is that the world didn't suddenly start to suck when humans overreached their divinely imposed limits and learned to distinguish between right and wrong. The world has been a killing field for over 500 million years. You know what the evidence for that is? Protective armor, the first hard exoskeletons. You know why those ancient critters needed exoskeletons? Because there were bigger critters trying to eat them. That's the world we were born into, and it's best we just deal with it. This chapter raises forbidden questions, only to squelch them with the threat of the death penalty for entertaining them. Apparently, such questions are not ours to pose or to ponder. Those questions are philosophical in nature and are placed off limits to such as we. The Mesopotamian sky god, like the autocrats in whose image that god is made, gets to do the thinking for everyone. That's the way it goes in a totalitarian dictatorship. As I pointed out last week in my coverage of Chapter 2, it's often easy to spot the tropes that have been introduced into these stories by later scribes and commentators when they take the form of obvious interpolations that break the story's narrative flow. In other cases, however, they're smuggled into the narrative in such a skillful way that they can escape the attention of the unwary reader. I suspect that the attribution of guile to the serpent is such a pious trope. The priesthood who crafted this story, no doubt over the course of several generations of priestcraft, couldn't have their readers thinking that the snake is the good guy in this story, could they? But what has the serpent brought to the woman's attention? Did he ever lie to her? Hasn't he first underscored what she presumably already knew? Incidentally, she would have learned it from her husband, not directly from God. In the 16th and 17th verses of chapter 2, we see that the warning not to eat of that tree was given to the man before the creation of his wife. And the Lord God commanded the man, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. He never said that to the woman. She must have learned it from her husband. This, of course, is in line with the whole misogynistic mindset of the ancient culture that gave us these stories. Women take instruction from men, never the other way around. The question that the serpent raises at the beginning of this chapter is meant to set the stage for what he's about to do. He's going to challenge that directive. He's going to point out to the woman that God knows better than that God's threat was meant only to cow his subjects into submission, was to keep them from thinking the way moral agents think, prevent them from questioning the directives of the dear leader. The serpent isn't trying to trick the woman into making the worst mistake she's ever made, thereby luring her into hell. He's trying to make the point that the capital crime is deciding for oneself what is right or wrong, that the distinction between right and wrong lies in something more than merely acquiescing to what is permitted and prohibited by a ruler who does other people's thinking for them. It's as if he's trying to get her to understand her moral potential, that she's more than a mere plaything of the ruler or of her husband, from whom her personhood was derived, according to chapter 2, that she's as capable of moral agency as those who keep her in her place. Of course, such ideas are called thought crimes, and the only context in which thought crimes can exist is that of a dictatorship. The Bible has a lot to say about thought crimes. Jesus even equated the thought of murder or adultery with the actual deed. Don't make the mistake of thinking that the Bible was intended as a roadmap to liberty. One of the most grotesque ideas I've ever encountered is one regularly bawled by Christian fundamentalists, that the U.S. Constitution is based on the Bible, that the Ten Commandments are the bedrock of our legal system. Bullshit. The rise of monotheistic religion was concurrent with the ascension of a ruling class whose dictates had to be obeyed. That's what it means to rule, isn't it? One doesn't rule territory or flocks of sheep. One rules people by telling them what they may do and what they must do. Contrary to much pious speculation, monotheistic religion does not represent the dawning of a more sublime conception of God over the primitive polytheism it replaced. It was formulated to place divine imprimatur on the prerogatives of the ruling class. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Monotheistic religions recognize a single heavenly autocrat, the structure of whose kingdom closely resembles, oddly enough, that of the kingdoms of the monarchs whose rule is legitimized by that monotheistic arrangement. The God of the Old Testament has far more in common with Solomon and Nebuchadnezzar than with the benevolent father figure of latter-day Christian doctrine. The ruling class have never appreciated it when commoners have dared to question their prerogatives, nor do they in our time. They recognize the danger that poses to their rule and will do everything in their power to prevent those questions from being asked. The snake is dangerous because he dares to raise those questions. He's trying to show her the way out of abject submission. He's doing the same thing I do in my classes and am attempting to do with these Sunday school lessons. The snake is a rabble-rouser, a social reformer, and probably an atheist. I am that hissing snake, and damn proud of it. Or perhaps better understood, that snake is our own dawning awareness, the still small voice that nags us from the periphery of our waking consciousness and makes us wonder if this autocratic arrangement is really all that legitimate, that divine right of kings bullshit. That voice is not trying to lead us to hell, as fundamentalists seem to think. It's trying to point the way to liberation, to moral maturity. As Madeline Murray O'Hare observed, an atheist is one who questions every kind of authority. And this is the thing that is important, because if we can, without blinking an eye, question the ultimate authority, God, who must be obeyed, then we can question the authority of the state, we can question the authority of the university structure, we can question the authority of our employer, we can question anything. But the author of this tale is not cheering for the snake. The author of this tale is not a champion of individual liberty. Returning to the story, I want to focus on the woman's reply to the serpent found in verses 2 and 3. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.'" The funny thing here is that the woman has introduced a detail that she apparently hatched in her own quietly stirring mind. Nor shall you touch it. I don't want to read too much into these stories, but this turn of phrase does call to mind those prohibitions about touching it found elsewhere in the Bible. Pursue that if you dare, and question it. The snake's response, found in verses 4 and 5, is the first real moment of truth found in the Bible. You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. I don't want to lavish a lot of time on this relatively minor point, but in verse 5, when the serpent tells her, "You will be like God," the word used at that point for God is probably better rendered the gods. Anyone who understands anything about the history of our species knows perfectly well that monotheism grew out of a pre-existing polytheistic matrix. Although biblical literalists deny this, of course, understanding polytheism to be a later corruption of the original divine revelation. Reading on, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves." I long ago noticed the close parallel between what the woman saw when she considered that tree in a new light and a warning found near the end of the New Testament in 1 John chapter 2. "Do not love the world or the things in the world. The love of the Father is not in those who love the world. For all that is in the world, the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, the pride in riches, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And the world and its desire are passing away, but those who do the will of God live forever." In my trusty old leather-bound King James, verse 16 of the foregoing appears thus: "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." The Revised Standard Version gives exactly the same translation. For the pride of life, the American Standard Version gives the vainglory of life, and so forth. This is one place where I feel my New Revised Standard Version comes up a little short. If, as I suspect, the author of 1 John was modeling his warning on what the woman in that old tale that he would certainly have known, what she saw once she decided to rise to the snake's challenge and set aside the fear of God that had been instilled in her and took a fresh look at that tree, tells you pretty much everything you need to know about Christianity and the awful damage it does to everyone who embraces it. Look at the words of the story. Good for food, pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise. The woman saw something that was good and beautiful and true. But the story that unfolds in Genesis 3 is a stern warning against everything that might bewitch you, everything that can be said to be good and beautiful and true. Those things are not of God, warns the author of 1 John, but are of the world. The Christian revelation warns believers again and again, do not be as the world is. Live for a life after this one, where you'll live forever in exchange for never having lived at all. Let the atheist Codger instruct you on this fine Sunday morning. Love what is good, including everything that tastes good to you, by which I mean far more than the food that tickles our taste buds, but do by all means love that too. Don't be a goddamn Puritan. Love that which is beautiful. That's why I spend my time with music and with my cats and none whatsoever with God. Those Telemann oboe concertos that I've been posting for the past few weeks are amazing and beautiful. You ought to watch those, listen to those, absorb those. Spend time with what is beautiful. While away your time with paintings and poetry and make that stuff without regard to anyone's preconceptions or expectations, including your own. Dance as though no one's watching, because if no one's in the room with you, no one's watching. There is no eye in the sky, thank God. Love that which is true. Love wisdom. Fall in love with the joy of discovering the truth of things if you haven't already. Anyone who judges you harshly for overturning every rock you come across and for arriving at the kinds of conclusions that that way of life leads you to is just another ape like you and me doing the best he can with what he's got, and his only problem is that he doesn't got enough. No sky fairy or demon is going to judge your ass, that's for sure. I'll finish this lesson with verse 7, and we'll continue with the story of the fall next week. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. This, of course, is the counterpoint to the final verse of chapter 2. The man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Here we find that they have become ashamed and try to hide their shame. I'm sure you know what's meant by that turn of phrase. But what exactly made them feel shame? Isn't it curious that the immediate effect of their awareness of good and evil centers on their own bodies? Did they find themselves aroused for the first time in their lives? From whom exactly were they trying to hide their shame? I've long been struck by what seems to me the most curious contradiction, if that's what it is, between the first two creation stories. In Genesis 1, God blesses his animate creations, including the humans he has molded in his image, and orders them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But in the second story, which, as I explained earlier, is a preamble to the fall, the first couple had no children until after they messed up and were driven out of the garden under the shadow of a curse. It is not until chapter 4 that the man knows his wife, and she bears a son whose name is Cain. You can't be fruitful and multiply unless you rub your naughty bits together. Why are those bits naughty? I think that here we're vouchsafed a hint that this story is far richer than it appears on the surface, for it has multiple layers of meaning. Do you remember the horror of puberty, when you lost your innocence and the world was turned upside down, when you were exiled from the blissful state of childhood, assuming your childhood was blissful, and forced to join the lifelong competition for food, prestige, and mates? While considering those questions, I think we ought not to lose sight of the role that religion has almost certainly played in making us feel shame. I'll bet our closest cousins, the chimps and bonobos, don't consider their own bits and each other's to be naughty, unshackled as they are by the bonds of monotheistic religion and the dualistic good or evil culture that's been tainted by it. What do you think? One final point. The woman saw that the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a fruit to be desired to make one wise. But of course, what the man and his wife experience as a result of eating that fruit is misery. Is that the same as wisdom? Samuel Taylor Coleridge seems to have understood it to be so. Remember his equation of sadness with wisdom at the end of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? This story has only begun, but I don't want to wear you down with an overlong Sunday school lesson since brunch and your afternoon revelry await you. I'll be back next week to tease apart the remainder of it, including its many curses.